We are a nation that has a government, not the other way around.
The common good of a collective, a race, a class, a state, was the justification of every tyranny ever established over man.
We, as Americans, have the capacity now, as we've had in the past, to do whatever needs to be done to preserve this last and greatest bastion of freedom.
The choice is not self-sacrifice or domination. The choice is independence or dependence.
Government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem.
This is the Dave Merlino Show.
That was Howard Rourke and Ronald Reagan, and this is the Dave Merlino Show. Don't know if any truer words have been spoken than the Gipper saying government is not the solution to the problem. Government is the problem. It certainly is. And Exhibit A, as you saw me pulling up here, the M1 Fed chart, which we talked about. I just want to recap quickly from last week. Inflation is the enemy. Inflation is the child of the creature from Jekyll Island, which is the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve is not helping anyone with this elastic money supply, which is unnecessary. And you can see our money supply was under $2 trillion, up around $4 trillion. COVID hit, and we skyrocketed to $21 trillion. Now, you'll hear people talk about $7 trillion because they look at the M3 money supply. The Fed counts different money supplies. The M1 is all the money. So I think it's the most comprehensive, and that is where the inflation is coming from. Everything else is a bunch of hogwash. Interestingly, this week, as if to give me some grist for my mill, there was a former federal chair on the Bloomberg TV show. His name was Gary something or other, and they asked him about inflation, and he said, well, the inflation is going to get down to 2% because of the expectation it will do so. He said the Federal Reserve expects it to get to 2%, and the ECB, central government authorities, central bank authorities believe it'll get to 2%. So because of their expectations, they believe inflation will go to 2%. Well, I am all for optimism and positive expectations in your life. If you listen to Brian Tracy's Psychology of Achievement, he said the one thing, a long 20-year study of successful people, and the one thing that really resonated, that was consistent, it didn't matter height, weight, sex, gender, where they're from, background, rich, poor, tall, short, thin, fat. None of it mattered in terms of getting wealthy and succeeding in life. But what did matter was positive expectations about outcomes. So if you have positive expectations about outcomes, that can, and you keep an optimistic, sunny point of view, that can make a difference in your life. However, when you print up $17 trillion and then get on TV and say we expect inflation to come down to 2%, that is not a positive expectation about outcome. That is Fantasy Island. That is a glittering jewel of colossal ignorance, if I may. So you can expect positive outcomes in your life, and I believe the results will come true. But you cannot expect positive outcomes that are unrealistic. For example, you can't expect to have a beautiful manicured yard and a beautiful lawn without doing any yard work or without ever mowing the lawn, okay? That is not a reasonable expectation. If you don't hire someone to mow the lawn and you don't mow the lawn, but you expect it to be beautiful, I promise you it won't. Now, maybe some of you are more powerful than me and you can pull that off. Good on you. God bless you. I do not think it's likely. Another piece of grist for my mill came across my desk this week. A friend of mine sent this over. So we've been told inflation is 3%. We have disinflation, and inflation's coming down. At one point, it was up to 9%, they said, and that's when they were freaking out. The natives were getting restless, and they were afraid 9% was too much for the nomads out here in hinterland to handle. So they gotta act, and the Fed raised interest rates, and then they expected inflation to go down, and everything's great now, and we're headed towards 2%, and everybody wants to cut interest rates. Well, this is something called the Chapwood Index, because You've been lied to your entire life about inflation. They mess with the numbers. The CPI is not accurate. And if you can go to this website. It's called the Chapwood Index. Let me see what the actual website is, and I'll tell you right now, so you can pull this up. Chapwoodindex.com. Chapwoodindex.com, and check out what they are saying actual inflation is. These are real people doing real numbers. So you're looking at 2017, 11% in New York, 2018, 12%, 2019, 12%. And then, after that massive printing of the money scenario, 15% in 22, 10% in 23, LA 15.5 and 11, Chicago 15 and 10, Houston 11 and 9, Phoenix 13 and 9, San Antonio 13.6, 9.8. You can go through and look at your city if you want, and they explain the problem with the CPI. Let me see if I can briefly get into that here. On the Chapwood website. It's quite a fabulous website. But in any event, you get the gist that the inflation is not what they were saying. The inflation is far worse than they were reporting. And these kind of numbers, I want to reiterate, the rich people, the asset class, Mark Cubans of the world, Warren Buffetts of the world, Charlie Munger, I think he recently passed away, God rest his soul, the Charlie Mungers of the world, the asset class, these numbers do not bury them, okay? These numbers specifically bury the poor, specifically bury the single parent, specifically bury the people that are working to make ends meet. This is crushing to them. As the Gipper said, inflation is worst on the struggling young and the fixed income elderly. So all of the asset class out there who these numbers don't clobber, don't crush, don't make poor, the Warren Buffetts of the world, they are not telling you the truth about inflation, and it's a shame. So we had mentioned last week talking about high time preference versus low time preference and the differences therein. High time preference, I learned this from Saifedean Ammous, who wrote the Bitcoin Standard. If you haven't read the Bitcoin Standard or listened to the Bitcoin Standard on Audible, I highly recommend it. It gets into Bitcoin, but it is more the history of money. It is fascinating. And Saifedean mentions several Austrian economists, Murray Rothbard, Ludwig von Mises, and Hans Hermann Hoppe. So I read Rothbard's book, What Government Has Done to Our Money, and I'm just finishing up Hans Hermann Hoppe's book, which is called A Brief History of Man, and he talks a lot about time preference in that book. It's a kind of an awkward, in my view, an awkward vernacular, an awkward turn of phrase. High time preference versus low time preference. I think Hans Hermann Hoppe gets it from Ludwig von Mises. I'm not positive of that, but I will find out. In any event, the high time preference is something that fiat money, which is what we're living in, fiat money encourages, okay? So high time preference means you have no patience and you want everything right now and you want to fulfill all your base desires right now and you're not looking to the future. So when your money and your savings is getting demolished by 10, 15, 20% inflation, well, you're not concerned about the future because you have to spend all that money to feed yourself right now, okay? Another way of talking about time preference, and they talk about this in Hoppe's book, The History of Man, Robinson Crusoe, if he wants to, he's stranded on an island, if he wants to eat, he has to go get a fish. So high time preference would be to fish right now and catch a fish and eat it. Low time preference would say, well, wait a minute, if I build something, if I have the intelligence and the wherewithal to build something to catch fish easier, I can catch more fish, I can catch fish easier and not have to spend so much time fishing, and it would be easier to feed myself. So he invents a net and builds a net. He takes the time to think about it, to invent something. He has a low time preference. He's preferring the future. He's preferring to plan for the future. He builds a fishing pole. Again, that would be low time preference. He's not going out and eating and fishing right this moment. He's waiting till later, and he's going to fish more efficiently. So fiat currency, when this planned government inflation is in our lives, it encourages high time preference. And if you look around America today, gambling is a very high time preference activity. Gambling is getting legalized everywhere. You've seen all the commercials on TV. Sports gambling is humongous now. It always has been, but it's even bigger now. And it's getting legalized in every state. A very high time preference activity. I would suggest in a low time preference environment, in an environment on hard money, in an environment where we had the gold standard, or we had a Bitcoin standard, or we had real actual money, not this fake, phony, baloney fiat nonsense, I would suggest gambling would still exist, but it wouldn't be as prevalent, it wouldn't be as powerful, it wouldn't be as popular. That would be is what I would suggest. And again, as if to give me grist for my mill, I got an article here from the AP. Zimbabwe just introduced another currency. They introduced the ZiG, and frankly, nobody wants it. They want to use American dollars because the American dollar is the reserve currency of the world, and it's still better than a lot of currencies. This helps the Fed get away with all of their machinations. The people in Zimbabwe are not too confident in the ZiG, and I'm going to show a couple of highlights here in this article, if I could. One is they had such hyperinflation in Zimbabwe that at one point, it was the Zimbabwe dollar before the ZiG, it cost $500 million for a loaf of bread. That is hyperinflation. That is massive inflation. Matter of fact, I have a $100 trillion bill with all of the zeros on it that I bought a few years ago for about $4 American. So you can see here in 2009. Now we're not talking 100 years ago here. We're not talking 50 years ago, 75 years ago. We're talking 15 years ago. 2009, the collapse of the Zimbabwe dollar and hyperinflation by 5 billion percent. 5 billion percent. And again, they are not a reserve currency anywhere. Nobody wants their money. So they tried to do what we do, which is print up trillions of dollars, but they actually suffered the actual consequences when you don't have a reserve currency. You don't have the luxury of being the reserve currency. You actually get hyperinflation. We're talking about 10%, and people are not happy. 10, 12, 15%. They were at 5 billion percent. So as you can see here, they're talking about how the U.S. dollar is a safer bet. They don't necessarily trust the ZiG yet. And I did want to point out, talking about high time preference, they talked about at one point during the hyperinflation of the Zimbabwe dollar. Here's where I was talking about the loaf of bread. At one point, a loaf of bread cost more than 500 million Zimbabwe dollars. And now, talk about high time preference, okay? Restaurants stopped displaying prices on menus as the prices would go up over the course of a dinner. Now, I'm reading this directly from the AP, okay? Restaurants stopped displaying prices. So talk about high time preference. Good gravy. You can't even, you have no idea what your price of your dinner is going to be because it changes so dramatically during the course of your dinner. So obviously, you are driven to spend all of your money quickly because it's getting demolished right before your very eyes. Inflation is a insidious, horrible thing, and we've been suffering terribly since we came officially off the gold standard in 1971. But as we talked about last week, we've been off the gold standard a lot longer. Okay, I want to get to our eloquence part of the day. Get your favorite cigar. I have my Odyssey Connecticut's. If you've never read this book, please get this book immediately. This is Ayn Rand's Fountainhead. You should get this on Audible if you want to listen to it in the car. Ed Herman, who was a pretty famous actor, he was the narrator. He did such an awesome job. He did Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged, knocked it out of the park. Spoiler alert, this is kind of the end of the book here. This is Rourke's. Howard Rourke is the protagonist. This is his speech. So if you don't want to hear this, you better tune out. And we will see you next week on podcast number 3. But please get the book, get the Audible. It's wonderful to listen to in the car, on the road, in the airplane, in the airport, wherever you are. It's fantastic. Or read the book. I've read Fountainhead at least 7 times in my life. It's really hard to put down. So, as I had mentioned, we have a dearth of eloquence on the airwaves. Sadly, I am not the most eloquent guy on the block, but I believe I have a good ear to recognize eloquence. Last week, you got to hear lovely Mr. Alan Keyes. This week is Howard Rourke from Ayn Rand's classic, The Fountainhead.
The prosecution rests, said the district attorney. The judge looked at Rourke. Proceed. His voice was gentle. Rourke got up. Your Honor, I shall call no witnesses. This will be my testimony and my summation. Take the oath. Rourke took the oath. He stood by the steps of the witness stand. The audience looked at him. For the first time, they could see him as he was, a man totally innocent of fear. For the flash of an instant, they grasped the manner of his consciousness. Each asked himself, do I need anyone's approval? Does it matter? Am I tied? And for that instant, each man was free enough to feel benevolence for every other man in the room. It was only a moment, the moment of silence when Rourke was about to speak. Thousands of years ago, the first man discovered how to make fire. He was probably burned at the stake he had taught his brothers to light. But he left them a gift they had not conceived, and he lifted darkness off the earth. Throughout the centuries, there were men who took first steps down new roads, armed with nothing but their own vision. The great creators, the thinkers, the artists, the scientists, the inventors, stood alone against the men of their time. Every new thought was opposed. Every new invention was denounced. The first motor was considered foolish. The airplane was considered impossible. Anesthesia was considered sinful. But the men of unborrowed vision went ahead. They fought, they suffered, and they paid. But they won. No creator was prompted by a desire to serve his brothers, for his brothers rejected the gift he offered. His truth was his only motive. His own work in his own way, that was his goal. The creation, not its users. The creation, not the benefits others derived from it. His vision, his strength, his courage came from his own spirit. A man's spirit, however, is his self, that entity which is his consciousness. To think, to feel, to judge, to act are functions of the ego. The creators are not selfless. The creator served nothing and no one. He lived for himself. And only by living for himself was he able to achieve the things which are the glory of mankind. Such is the nature of achievement. Man cannot survive except through his mind. But the mind is an attribute of the individual. There's no such thing as a collective brain, a collective thought. The primary act, the process of reason, must be performed by each man alone. The creative faculty belongs to single, individual men. That which it creates is the property of the Creator. Nothing is given to man on earth. Everything he needs has to be produced. Man can survive in only one of two ways, by the independent work of his own mind, or as a parasite fed by the minds of others. The Creator originates, the parasite borrows. The Creator's concern is the conquest of nature. The parasite's concern is the conquest of men. The Creator lives for his work. His primary goal is within himself. The parasite lives second-hand. Others become his prime motive. The basic need of the Creator is independence. To a Creator, all relations with men are secondary. The second-hander places relations first. He preaches altruism, the doctrine which demands that man live for others and place others above self. Men have been taught that the highest virtue is not to achieve, but to give. Yet one cannot give that which has not been created. Creation comes before distribution. Yet we are taught to admire the second-hander who dispenses gifts he had not produced above the man who made the gifts possible. We praise an act of charity. We shrug at an act of achievement. Men have been taught that their first concern is to relieve the suffering of others, but suffering is a disease. Should one come upon it, one tries to give relief and assistance. To make that the highest test of virtue is to make suffering the most important part of life. Then man must wish to see others suffer in order that he may be virtuous. Men have been taught that the ego is the synonym of evil, and selflessness the ideal of virtue. But the Creator is the egotist in the absolute sense, and the selfless man is the one who does not think, feel, judge, or act. These are functions of the self. Egotism was held to mean the sacrifice of others to self. Altruism, the sacrifice of self to others. This tied man irrevocably to other men and left him nothing but a choice of pain. His own pain borne for the sake of others, or pain inflicted upon others for the sake of self. This was the greatest fraud ever perpetrated on mankind. The choice is not self-sacrifice or domination. The choice is independence or dependence. The egotist, in the absolute sense, is not the man who sacrifices others. He is the man who stands above the need of using others in any manner. He does not exist for any other man, and he asks no other man to exist for him. This is the only form of brotherhood and mutual respect possible between men. This is the only possible form of relationship between equals. Anything else is a relation of slave to master or victim to executioner. From the beginning of history, the two antagonists have stood face to face, the Creator and the second-hander. When the first Creator invented the wheel, the first second-hander responded. He invented altruism. The contest has another name, the individual against the collective. The common good of a collective, a race, a class, a state, was the justification of every tyranny ever established over men. Now observe the results of a society built on the principle of individualism. This, our country, the noblest country in the history of men, the country of greatest achievement, greatest prosperity, greatest freedom. This country was based on a man's right to the pursuit of happiness, his own happiness, not anyone else's. The savage's whole existence is public, ruled by the laws of its tribe. Civilization is the process of setting man free from men. It is an ancient conflict. Now, in our age, collectivism has broken loose and is running amok. It has swallowed most of Europe. It is engulfing our country. I am an architect. I know what is to come by the principles on which it is built. We are approaching a world in which I cannot permit myself to live. Now you know why I dynamited Cortland. I designed Cortland. I gave it to you. I destroyed it. I agreed to design Cortland for the purpose of seeing it erected as I designed it. That was the price I set for my work. I was not paid. The owners of Cortland got what they needed from me. They wanted a scheme devised to build a structure as cheaply as possible. They found no one else who could do it to their satisfaction. I could, and did. They took the benefit of my work and made me contribute it as a gift. But I'm not an altruist. I do not contribute gifts of this nature. It is said that I destroyed the home of the destitute. It is forgotten that but for me the destitute could not have had this particular home. It is believed that the poverty of the future tenants gave them a right to my work, that their need constituted a claim on my life. I came here to say that I do not recognize anyone's right to any achievement of mine, no matter who makes the claim, how large their number, or how great their need. I wish to come here and say that I am a man who does not exist for others. It had to be said. The world is perishing from an orgy of self-sacrificing. I wish to come here and say that the integrity of a man's creative work is of greater importance than any charitable endeavor. Those of you who do not understand this are destroying the world. I wish to come here and state my terms. I do not care to exist on any others. I recognize no obligations toward men except one, to respect their freedom and to take no part in a slave society. To my country, I wish to give the 10 years which I will spend in jail if my country exists no longer. I will spend them in memory and in gratitude for what my country has been. It will be my act of loyalty, my refusal to live or work in what has taken its place. Rourke stood, his legs apart, his head lifted, as he stood in an unfinished building.
That was Howard Rourke from Ayn Rand's classic, The Fountainhead. It was just fabulous. Next week, maybe this is some foreshadowing, maybe not. Our quote of the day today from Ayn Rand's magnum opus, Atlas Shrugged. This is Francisco d'Ancona from his famous money speech. Quote, "Until and unless you discover that money is the root of all good, you ask for your own destruction. When money ceases to be the tool by which men deal with one another, then men become the tools of men. Blood, whips, or guns. Blood, whips, and guns, or dollars. Take your choice. There is no other, and your time is running out." See you next week.